It's my pleasure today to welcome you all to this really unique event, an opportunity for us to hear from someone who was involved directly in the Abraham Peace Accords, and not only because of his role, but because of the fact that he is a native Iowan. First of all, let me start out by introducing myself for those of you who I have not met in person or virtually before. My name is Charles Schneider. I'm one of the co-chairs of Iowans Supporting Israel. Tom Henderson is the other, and you'll be hearing from him at the end of this meeting. And let me introduce Iowans Supporting Israel. Iowans Supporting Israel was founded in 2013 as a non-for-profit and bipartisan organization whose purpose is to encourage citizens across Iowa and America to support and defend the rights of the state of Israel. We've been around now for several years, and it's my pleasure to recognize a few people who we have here as dignitaries. One of them is Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg, who's joining us. Former Ambassador Ken Quinn is also with us. And Carol Olson, the State Director for Senator Grassley, is also joining us today. The format of this is I'll introduce Brian and I'll ask him some questions. And I'm sure many of you will have questions too as we proceed. If you do, please use the chat function to submit those, and I'll select from those as we go along. And at the end of our conversation with Brian, we will turn this to Tom Henderson and ask him to make some final comments. So I'll start now first by introducing Brian Hook. Brian is a diplomat who has worked for President George H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush, and President Donald Trump. He was the lead State Department official who negotiated the peace agreements between the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and Israel, collectively known as the Abraham Peace Accords. He also conducted secret negotiations with Iran in 2019 and 2020 that ended in the release of 2 American hostages. And in 2018, he flew to North Korea with Secretary Pompeo to bring home 3 Americans who had been held hostage by Kim Jong-Un. From 2016 to 2020, Brian led the campaign to counter the Iranian regime's use of terrorism and its pursuit of nuclear weapons. He has held a number of senior positions in the Bush administration, including Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Special Assistant to the President for Policy at the White House, and Counsel in the Office of Legal Policy at the Justice Department. He was also a corporate lawyer at Hogan and Hartson in Washington, D.C. from 1999 until 2003. His many foreign policy articles have been published by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he's been featured by major media outlets around the world for his commentary on international affairs. On a personal level, I first met Brian when he and I were both attending the University of Iowa Law School. And he struck me then as someone who was very intelligent and just a brilliant speaker, brilliant person. I'm sure he graduated much higher in his law school class than I did in mine. I can almost guarantee that. And I always knew that we'd be reading about him down the road somewhere. And it's been fun to watch his career progress over the last 15, 20 years, however long it's been since we graduated from law school, Brian. And it's just a pleasure to welcome you here. So thank you for joining us to discuss the Abraham Peace Accords. I'll just go into the first question and kick things off. So I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of the Abraham Peace Accords and kind of knows what they are, but many people may not have seen anything more than just a headline. So could you start out, Brian, by just telling us a little bit about what the Abraham Peace Accords are?
Happy to, Charles, Senator Schneider. That's a very nice introduction. I am a 5th generation Iowan and has spent about the last 20 years in Washington since leaving Iowa City when Charles and I finished law school. I apologize for not matching my attire with Charles. I'm on vacation here in Jamestown, Virginia with my family, and we're staying at a resort, and I'm sorry that I'm not in a suit and tie. This is kind of a nice homecoming to be able to talk with Iowans for Israel, two subjects near and dear to my heart, Iowa and Israel, and both combined in one organization. Charles, you asked about the Abraham Accords and sort of the broad picture. Israel, as I'm sure everybody on this format knows, Israel had only brokered peace with two countries prior to the Trump administration, and that was Egypt under Anwar Sadat, and then Jordan later. It was 27 years that elapsed between Jordan's peace agreement and the peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And then we were able to do 3 more peace agreements. So we went from a 27-year period between one agreement, and then we did 4 in 4 months. And the first one we did was with UAE. And then about a month later, we were able to announce the Kingdom of Bahrain. And then after Bahrain, we were able to get Sudan. And then after that, we got Morocco. And Morocco has a noble history of tolerance towards Israel and the Jewish people. I have been to a Jewish cemetery in Morocco. The kings of Morocco have always been very tolerant and very welcoming. And so that felt particularly good. There are many Moroccan Jews who live in Israel. And so to have the last one as Morocco was very nice. So we've now had these 4 peace agreements done. There was also Kosovo during the Trump administration announced that it would normalize relations with Israel. And so now that's 5. It really was gratifying to be able to work on it. The credit for this, I was the lead State Department negotiator, but all of this was made possible by Jared Kushner. The president had assigned him as the lead for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And Jared and I worked on that for about 3 years together. After we had rolled out our vision for economic and political peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we then were able to get the 4 peace agreements done. And so Jared just did a superb job. We can talk about that further later, but that was sort of the very broad framing of the Abraham Accords. And since Abraham is the father of the 3 faiths of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And I remember I traveled with President Trump on his first trip overseas, and we went to Saudi Arabia, and we went to Israel, and we went to the Vatican. And that's how the administration started, and then it ended with the Abraham Accords, which was a nice coda to that first trip, where we visited the centers of the 3 faiths in Saudi Arabia with Mecca and Medina, with Israel, and then at the Vatican. And so it was a remarkable 4 years, and I was proud to be a part of it.
Yeah, they truly were historic, and it's nice to know exactly what the agreements kind of are, who they're with. I'm also curious to know how they actually started. I mean, once Jared Kushner was appointed as the person to kind of lead things off, and you were brought in with the team as well, how did you decide, okay, we're going to start with these 4 countries? How did you reach out to them? Were they receptive initially? Did you have to, do any convincing? Can you just kind of walk us through that process a little bit?
Well, Charles, I think we wouldn't have been able to get the 4 peace agreements done had we not presented a vision for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that was a process that was 3 years in the making. We were able to roll out the plan, I want to say, in January of 2019, if memory serves. And when we first announced our economic vision, and we did that in Bahrain, and that was an economic vision so that the Palestinian people would have a better future than the one that they're currently facing. I think the Palestinian people have been let down enormously by their own leadership. And we put forward an economic vision that would, we think, promote the dignity, the safety, the economic security of the lives of the Palestinian people. Then we followed that up with a political proposal to resolve issues around borders and all the issues that have been kind of front burner issues for decades and are still unsolved. I think what was historic about our peace plan was that it was the first time that Israel, that the government of Israel, and it was endorsed by not only Likud, but also by Blue and White, when you had Benny Gantz there and Bibi Netanyahu. They endorsed a map. And it was the first time that Israel, in all of the peace talks over so many decades, had agreed to a map that would establish the borders that Israel would need to defend itself. And this is a country that had been invaded 3 times. And so it's very important that Israel have borders that are secure and defensible. And we were able to, I mean, it was years of work, very difficult work with the Israeli government. And we were able to agree on a map. And nobody had ever done that before. And so I think whoever then picks up the file is going to inherit a map that Israel has already agreed to. After the plan was released, unfortunately, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, refused to come to the negotiating table with Israel and to engage. We were very pleased that many Arab governments, after we released our economic and political vision, had said that this is a good faith effort that should be the basis of talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And in spite of that support by so many Arab governments, President Abbas would not come to the table. And I think that created an opening. Unfortunately, President Abbas has lived up to his stereotype of never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. He should have come to the negotiating table. What we put forward was a very credible and good faith and thoughtful vision to improve the lives of both the Palestinian and the Israeli people. If there were things in the plan that President Abbas did not like, he should have come to the table and registered those concerns and begin talks with the Israelis, but he didn't. And I think that because he again missed another opportunity at the expense of his own people, there were a number of Arab governments that decided, if he's not going to come to the negotiating table with Israel, then we will. And prior to our administration, and you see this with Secretary of State Kerry during the Obama administration, he said there will be no separate peace. You can find the video online. He said there will be no separate peace among Arabs and Israelis until there's first peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That was a mistake. That was just simply bad statecraft, very bad diplomacy. You had a number of Arab governments even then that were tired of having their futures held back by giving a veto to the Palestinian Authority over their future. And look at all of the economic and cultural and diplomatic ties that have now been catalyzed between UAE and Israel. I mean, there's scores of stories about this warm peace, not a cold peace, a warm peace between UAE and Israel. I want to say 50,000 Israelis have already visited Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And you've already had a number of Israelis who've had weddings at hotels that serve kosher food in UAE. When I was in the Oval Office for the first peace agreement that was announced and the president brought in the press, I said, he asked if I wanted to say a few words, and I said, Mr. President, historians will remember this peace agreement between Israel and the UAE as the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is in fact what is happening. There's still work to do on the Palestinian side, but we are witnessing history with the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
We certainly hope that's true. One of my next question was going to be about the fact that we've had fits and starts, it seems, when it comes to the peace process in the Middle East, since the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan were signed decades ago. And I had intended to ask you, what were the factors? What were the reasons why this time it was successful, whereas so many other times it hadn't? I think you've answered a lot of that in your previous statement here, just mentioning the fact of the passage of time, presenting a political solution, presenting boundaries, not wanting to be held hostage by Mahmoud Abbas, all seem to have played factors. Were there others that you think resulted in these coming together where other efforts had failed?
Well, Charles, you're right to ask the other factors, because I omitted a key factor, and that was the president's campaign to counter the Islamic Republic of Iran. During the Obama administration, they had taken a policy of telling our Sunni Arab partners and Israel that they would have to find a way to share the Middle East with Iran, with the Iranian regime. That had the effect of alienating our best friends in the region. When we came into office, and reading President Trump's Riyadh speech is definitely worth everybody's time. That is an extraordinary speech, and even in that speech in 2017, he's already telegraphing the possibility of new agreements in the region. He put in place a strategy of countering the Iranian regime. We were able to then build a platform countering the Iranian regime, and we invited Israel and our Sunni Gulf partners onto that platform. And together we confronted the common enemy of Iran. And you mentioned, Charles, during the introduction that I had led secret talks between, I don't know if it was in your introduction, but we did a global ministerial on peace in the Middle East to promote it in Warsaw, Poland. And I was able to organize at a private dinner in the president of Poland's palace. We were able to get the Prime Minister of Israel and almost all of the Arab foreign ministers in the same room. And we did a panel discussion during the dinner. And you had all of these Arab foreign ministers talking about what it's like to be on the front lines of Iranian aggression and how happy they were to see the United States standing up to this regime after 8 years of accommodating Iran. And then you had Prime Minister Netanyahu go up. And if you closed your eyes, you really couldn't tell where the differences started or ended. They really had the same vision. We were able to, I think, build deeper ties. After that Warsaw conference, I then started a secret dialogue that ran for 9 months with the Emiratis and the Israelis. And we met in Washington, in Jerusalem, and in Abu Dhabi, in UAE. And we had the Emiratis, going in secretly into Jerusalem. They all came over to the United States, and we kept it out of the press for 9 months. We were talking about how to counter the Iranian regime. Those conversations could not happen during the prior 8 years because the United States had a policy of largely appeasing the Iranian regime. And that was, I've always believed that the United States should be no better friend and no worse enemy. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of our friends in the Middle East felt betrayed. I know that some of our Sunni Arab partners had publicly said that the Iran nuclear deal was a betrayal. It is my view that for as long as any administration, Republican or Democrat, has a policy of essentially betraying our friends in the Middle East and accommodating our adversaries, there will be no more peace deals. Because you don't have the trust. The United States is the indispensable broker of these kinds of agreements. And you look at that historically, Egypt under Carter, Jordan under Clinton, and then 4 under Trump, right? So you have a bipartisan convening power. When the United States, Madeleine Albright is right, the United States is the indispensable partner, the indispensable nation. And so when we get it right, we're able, I think, to really help promote peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. And we also can do a lot to normalize relations between the Palestinian people and Israel. So I hope, we're very early in the Biden administration. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration plays the hand that they inherited very strongly. They have a very strong hand right now. And inheriting such a strong hand puts them in a position to not only continue these peace agreements, but to also ensure that Iran never acquires, Iran should not have any nuclear enrichment capability to ever threaten Israel or the United States. And so if they're going to go back into an Iran nuclear deal, they have to get no enrichment, because that's the most important thing. If we can guarantee that Iran, the Iranian regime, cannot get a nuclear weapon, and the way to do that is to prohibit enrichment. If we're able to do that, then Israel and the United States is in a much, much stronger and more secure place. And so I hope the Biden administration, obviously I wish them all the best in continuing the very successful work that we did in the Middle East.
And that actually addresses one of the questions that someone's already entered into the chat box, and that gives me an opportunity to remind everyone else on this conference to please, if you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box. You can do that from your handheld device if you're using that, or your computer. Just hit the chat function on your screen and then type in your question. Brian, let me ask you a little bit about just the process itself and what that looked like. I think a lot of people probably picture talks like this as being between two parties usually, and not necessarily involving a third party like the United States to help broker it. Maybe that's, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think that's just kind of the image people have in their minds. So can you talk a little bit about what these talks actually looked like to get the deals done, and what role you played in them?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Charles, I was brought on by Secretary Tillerson, and then I got to know Jared Kushner early in the administration, and Secretary Tillerson asked me to be his point person, working with Jared on the peace process. And then when Secretary Pompeo came in, he asked me to continue that work, but also to become the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran and to lead the effort to counter the Iranian regime. That process that Jared started in the beginning, he didn't have a history on this. Jared is not, written a number of books on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict or on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He was working in the private sector, and quite happily, when his father-in-law was elected president. He had not planned on being the point person, I think, on this process. It ended up being a great virtue. When I was in the Bush administration, I worked on the margins on the peace process. Jared came to this with a fresh set of eyes, and there probably wasn't any historical conflict that was more ready for new thinking than this one. Anybody who comes into office, you tend to, you reach into the top drawer of your desk and or you go onto your computer and you type in Arab-Israeli conflict, and then you get the talking points. And that's true for all governments. Anybody who comes into office, you say, okay, I've got a meeting with the boss. I've got a meeting with Netanyahu. I've got a meeting with MBZ or MBS or the King of Bahrain. And, everybody puts together really thoughtful and smart talking points. But a lot of those talking points reflect a kind of conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is sometimes behind the times. And in this case, Jared came in and really, instead of kind of starting with the talking points, he listened. So we would go to the region, and we would go there very quietly, and we'd get around to Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Turkey, Jordan, Qatar, Israel. And then we'd also go to see the E3, the Brits, the French, and the Germans. We'd see the Poles, the Japanese have always had a big historic interest in this. And we'd listen, he would listen. And there was definitely enormous fatigue with the Palestinian Authority. That was very clear. There was enormous fatigue with how the Palestinian Authority had failed its own people. And I'm talking about Arab fatigue. And that started to make us think, that there might be an opening here. And early on, we knew that there might be an opportunity, but we weren't sure how, you're waiting for more hands, you're waiting for more cards in your hand to build it. Ultimately, it came in year 4 of the administration. But we would go to all these countries and we would spend a few days at a time there. Unfortunately, the role of the Secretary of State is a lot of public diplomacy, and you're kind of scheduled in 30-minute increments. Jared had the advantage of really getting into these countries and spending a few days at a time there, really getting to know. Trust is very important. Trust is enormously important in the Middle East. And he built that trust. He built deep friendships. And so when there was an opportunity in year 4, we had built up kind of a deep reservoir of trust and goodwill that allowed us to broker the first peace agreement and then 3 more that followed. We did 2 in the Middle East and 2 in Africa and 1 in Europe. You can only do something like that in such a short period of time when you've done all of your due diligence and you've spent the time that's necessary in the region. And Jared really logged the hours that were necessary. And it was a real honor to be a part of that process, to meet with foreign ministers, emirs, kings, the Sultan of Oman. Really fascinating diplomacy, and it all came together. It's one of the Jared and I have talked a number of times. We were together a couple of weeks ago. We've talked about, if there could have been a second term, there would have been there would have been many more peace agreements, some big ones. Look, the trend lines in the region are very positive, and you're going to see Arabs and Israelis come closer together. And I'm hopeful that Israel is going to be a part of the security architecture to deal with Iranian threats. Obviously we partner with Israel, we defend Israel, we support Israel's right to defend itself. But then you've got all these other Sunni Arab countries in the region, and now Israel is partnered with them. And that's a really good thing. It's burden sharing in the Middle East. It's going to diminish the role the United States has to play by grouping these countries on the common platform of countering Iran.
So that was a big tease there. So you mentioned other countries could have fallen into place. We want names. Give us some names. Who's on the cusp? Who's close? To the extent
I wish I could. I think that you have opportunities in the Gulf, some big opportunities in the Gulf, but then you've also got opportunities in Asia. And I had started some of those conversations with some key countries in Asia, even after the election. After President Trump lost, there was a real momentum that we were able to effect, and it's just too bad. Look, we have teed this up beautifully for the Biden administration to take advantage of it, and I think the American people really need to encourage the Biden team not to miss this opportunity. To let's not return to sort of the John Kerry mindset of there will be no separate peace between Arabs and Israelis until we get the Palestinian thing sorted out. We have demonstrated just how wrong-headed that kind of thinking is. And by the way, that's very dangerous. That sort of thinking delayed peace for many years. And for every year that there isn't peace between Arabs and Israelis, people die. These have real world consequences. And so we have got to put, I just think sometimes, especially in the Middle East, there's no small degree of a kind of an anti-Israel bias that I think is disguised in various ways that I think we need to get past. We need to get past this sort of ideology, this ideological approach to the Middle East. President Trump took an approach of principled realism, and Jared Kushner came into the region, as I said, with sort of a clean sheet and open to new possibilities, new modes and orders, and he just wasn't clouded by ideology. And he also didn't come to the region with this mindset of I'm going to make the region conform to my ideology. And you've had some American diplomats guilty of that. And I think we need to be very realistic about this, recognize the fatigue that Americans have with endless wars in the region. You know, we were able to, I think, moderate Sunni extremism, and we were able to counter Shia extremism. And given how Islamist extremism has cost the United States so much in blood and treasure, we really need to continue that work of countering the Sunni and Shia extremism. And when you look at the work coming out of the Gulf today, in 2019, UAE had the Year of Tolerance, and Pope Francis came to the Gulf. The first Pope in history came to the Gulf at the invitation of Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE. And you have all these countries normalizing with Israel. That is, I think, the future of the Middle East. And I've never been more hopeful about it. These are the kind of governments that we need to be supporting a moderate vision of Sunni Islam, and also standing up to sort of extremist versions of Shia Islam. The Iranian people do not believe in how the government has approached these issues of religion and state. And I think the Iranian people would very much like to be a part of the Abraham Accords. And I know that that's an outrageous statement to the Iranian regime, but the Iranian people, when you go back to Cyrus the Great, who's in the Hebrew Bible, Persia has a distinguished history going back to Cyrus the Great of religious tolerance. And this regime is an aberration. And I think the Iranian people would like to normalize with Israel. They would also like to have better relations with the American people. And it's, the Iranian people have had highs and lows of governments that have been representative. There was a constitutional revolution in the early 1900s. And in the succeeding decades, you've had peaks and valleys. The last 41 years will be remembered as the dark ages for the Iranian people.
That's some great perspective. Liz Rhodes had a question. She wanted to know specifically if there's an Israel-Turkey agreement in the offing. It doesn't sound like we'll get any specific opinion from you on that, and that's understandable. She did have another question, though, that I want to put to you. She wants to know if there was something specific that caused these five, counting Kosovo, countries to enter into these agreements with Israel and trust in the United States that just had not been present in the past.
I don't know if it was a matter of personnel or if it was timing or presidential leadership. There were a number of factors that went into this, but there's no question that Prime Minister Netanyahu's government trusted us, and we were able to negotiate a map. That was very important. And we were able to reach an agreement that, as I said, that both Likud and Blue and White supported. And so across that kind of political spectrum, we were able to get support. And that plan also had support from a lot of key Arab governments. I remember when we announced our plan in the East Room of the White House, we had 3 or 4 Arab ambassadors attend in person. And this was before you had the 4 normalizations. So trust was a big factor in this. Having the right Iran policy was, looking back, indispensable. If you have the wrong Iran policy, you're just not able to, they don't trust you. Because if you are betraying our kind of key partners in the region, they're not going to trust you to broker difficult agreements. And that's why we were able to get done the 4 that we did. So not everybody sort of connects the dots between our Iran policy and the peace agreements, but it was indispensable. That's why when I started as the Iran envoy, I'd been working on Iran for the prior 2 years, but I was also working on North Korea and the free and open Indo-Pacific. I was working on Latin America, a bunch of issues. But when I started focusing on Iran, I said to Jared, he and I both saw our files as mutually reinforcing. When Jared and I would go to the region, we'd sit there and spend time with a lot of our friends in the Arab and the Israeli community. They really wanted to talk about Iran. And Jared noticed this, he picked up on this, that this was, very high on their to-do list, because if you don't have security, it's really hard to have economic prosperity. Security always comes first. And they really felt like that the Iranian regime, through its proxies, its Shia proxies in Syria, Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Palestine Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen, had all gathered strength during the Obama years. And I remember there was an Iranian official in 2012 or 2013 who had bragged that the Iranian regime had now owned the capitals of Beirut, Damascus, and Baghdad. And they would later claim to be owning the capital of Yemen. That is what King Abdullah described as the Shia Crescent. And this Shia Crescent, with all of these proxies that were rich and armed to the teeth, courtesy of the Iranian regime, they gained strength because we had the wrong Iran policy. And I am hopeful that we have demonstrated over the last 4 years what a successful Iran policy looks like. Look, I made it a point of working very closely with Democrats when I was at the State Department. So I would work a lot with Senator Menendez, who was the ranking member of Senate Foreign Relations. And I also worked a lot with the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel. You had a number of people, Senator Schumer, Senator Menendez, Chairman Engel, a number of Democrats who opposed the Iran deal. It did not have the support of the American people. It still doesn't have the support of the American people. And so I hope the Biden administration does not rush back into this deal, give up all of the leverage that they inherited because of the sanctions walls that we built around the regime, and get the kind of deal that is going to permanently address Iran's nuclear program.
Thanks for that, Brian. I'm going to move to a different topic here. Bob Goldberg just posed a question that has been in the back of my mind too. We're kind of ripping up the script here, but not totally. Brian's question, or Bob's question, is: might the newly announced Iran-China 25-year agreement impact Arab states' motivation to move closer to Israel? And I think that speaks to the broader question of, what's China doing? What are they after here? They've got President Xi has his one belt, one road policy. They're building infrastructure out all over the world, defaulting on some places that don't make the payments after the construction is done. What is China looking to gain here, and how does that impact the overall peace process in the Middle East?
This is the second agreement that's been announced between China and Iran. There was an agreement that was announced, I want to say, in 2020, and I wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal after they did their first agreement, and it's titled "The Totalitarian Twins," and you can find it online. That's where I kind of give my full analysis of the China-Iran axis. It is very bad for the region. There are a number of countries in the region, I think, that have flirted with the kind of China offer. And Charles, you talked about the economic piece. China practices predatory economics, and I think the world is waking up to this. There are many countries that have been caught in the debt trap that China creates, where they just present eye-watering sums of money to fairly economically challenged regimes. I'll say that, generously. And then when they're not able to make the payments, they flip the debt to equity. And then the next thing you know, China owns a lot of your country. China would like to, they would like to build out a global architecture of ports and bases and economic footholds that are not in the interest of the companies, of the countries that they're partnering with. The United States is definitely, we're a more demanding partner, but we always prize sovereignty when we're talking about economics. We go in and we very much believe in a win-win outcome. When China says win-win, what that translates into Chinese is 2 wins for China. It is not win-win in the Western sense of the understanding. So President Trump stood up to the Chinese government in ways that don't have any historic precedent. This is a bipartisan issue. I think all of the United States is alive and deeply sensitive to the China as a strategic challenge to the United States, militarily, economically, culturally. You know, superpowers make the world in their own image. That is a sort of an axiom of history. That's why you've had the Roman order, the Ottoman order, the Greek order, the Persian Empire, the British Empire. All of these governments seek to create a world in its image. We live in a world that America has largely fashioned in its image. If we were to live in a world that was created in the image of China, the world would be a much darker place, not only for us, but for our friends and partners around the world. So we very much need, there should be ways for us to work with China where it is fair, where it's reciprocal, and it is balanced. And that's what I think President Trump announced as our metrics for progress in the bilateral relationship: fair trade, reciprocal trade, and free trade. I think the Biden administration is going to continue this. I think all the countries in the region who have been kind of attacked by Iran, or who are threatened by Iran, when they see what China is doing to get in bed with the Iranian regime, that tells them everything they need to know about China as a partner. They need to be very careful about this.
Michelle Lubke also has a question. She wants to know about what methods or tactics you use to build trust during crucial conversations that you had with the parties involved as you were moving towards these final agreements. Did you regale them with your stories from your playing days for the Bettendorf Bulldogs or your time in law school, or what exactly did you do to try and build some rapport, build some trust with all sides involved?
I think this is the same Michelle Libke who was Michelle Luton, who married my friend Jim Libke. So if it is the same, hello, Michelle. Yes, we're both fellow Bulldogs. They were not interested in my lackluster athletic performance as a Bulldog on the BHS golf team. Nor on the track team. There was no interest in that, I can say firsthand. You know what, the trust thing, President Trump did what he said he would do. So you had a number of presidents who all said that they would move the embassy to Jerusalem. None of them did it. I think it goes back to President Clinton, I want to say, was the first one who, it was part of a law that was passed by Congress to move the embassy, to make Jerusalem as where we recognize that as the capital. Every president from Clinton all the way through Obama said they would do it and didn't do it. President Trump did it. He also recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He left the UN Human Rights Council. He repeatedly supported Israel's right to defend itself. He said all of these things when he ran for president. And I think people outside of the United States who follow American elections, they follow it very closely. They keep track, they keep a scorecard of, promises kept, promises not kept. Everybody in the region, I heard this repeatedly from, these are heads of government. President Trump and Jared were all people that you could trust that if they say they're going to do it, they do it. And that, sort of keeping your word is like the currency of trust. And so the president did all these historic things. People respected it, especially in the Middle East. He showed strength at the right times, and he showed restraint at the right times. And he won the respect of a lot of key governments in the region, even when they disagreed. Like, for instance, plenty of Arab governments disagreed with the embassy move, but they respected him for keeping his word. You've had other presidents who have, said that they're going to do something, but then they end up not doing it. I think it just weakens them. I just, as a personal matter on chemical weapons is a bipartisan issue. When Assad was using chemical weapons against his own people, and that was a red line that we said would be enforced and we didn't enforce it, that eroded trust in a lot of places outside of the Middle East, because they pay attention to these things. So if it's fine to say that you're announcing a red line, but when that red line is crossed, you definitely have to respond to it. And so I was very pleased that President Trump restored the norm against the use of chemical weapons by bombing Syria twice after Assad had used chemical weapons. And that's something that I hope we don't ever make that mistake again, of not taking all necessary measures to prohibit the use of chemical weapons around the world.
Thanks, Brian. I think we've got time for one more question here. We'll have to keep it to maybe a couple minutes response at the longest. There's a question from, I apologize, I know I'm probably not pronouncing the name correctly, but Ron Rabi, I believe, R-A-N-R-A-B-I. And he'd like to know, you've talked a lot about Iran and how curtailing Iran's ambitions has been a unifying force for a lot of countries in the Middle East who you and the Trump administration were able to work with to put peace deals together. What do you think that an agreement, if we were to move back into an agreement with Iran, what kind of impact would that have on the peace process moving forward?
Well, I'll give a short answer, and I'm happy to answer one or two more questions. If you've got more, I'll just give a shorter answer. It all depends on what kind of terms the Biden administration is able to negotiate on the Iran deal. If the Biden administration simply re-enters the Iran nuclear deal in return for Iran coming back into compliance with its nuclear commitments under the deal, I think that will be a missed opportunity. Under the Iran nuclear deal, the United States is not allowed to impose any sanctions on Iran's oil exports or on any of Iran's banks, which are epicenters of terror finance and money laundering. We blacklisted most of Iran's banks when we got out of the Iran deal, and we also functionally zeroed out Iran's oil exports. Iran was exporting 2.7 million barrels of oil a day when we got out of the Iran deal. We brought that number down to 70,000 barrels. That's 3% of the world's oil supply that we took off the market. And I will add, the price of Brent went down $2. So we balanced our economic and security interests very nicely there. If the Biden administration simply returns to the deal, and in exchange for giving up all of this pressure on oil and banking, only in exchange for Iran going back into compliance, we will have given up our leverage to get the kind of deals on regional aggression and intercontinental ballistic missiles and inspections. And also, I will remind everybody, the Iran nuclear deal is temporary. It's already started expiring. The arms embargo on Iran under the deal expired last year. This deal is going to continue to unravel. And whenever I press some of my friends who negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, I said, well, what are you going to do when this deal expires and Iran is stronger economically and its proxies are stronger economically? They said, well, we'll address that when we get to it. We need to have an outcome on the Iran deal that ends all enrichment. The Iranian regime does not need to enrich nuclear material to have peaceful nuclear power. The United Arab Emirates is celebrating its 11th year of peaceful nuclear power. They have no centrifuges, no enrichment. Libya no longer has a nuclear program. If we can have, Iran can have all the peaceful nuclear power at once, but it may not enrich nuclear material. It doesn't need to do it. And this regime has a notorious history of playing cat and mouse with the UN nuclear watchdog. So that's why I'd like to see no enrichment as the standard of success for the next nuclear deal.
Brian, thank you for that. Thank you for your time here this afternoon. This has just been a fascinating conversation. It has really been a pleasure to be able to invite an Iowan who has done a lot to support Israel through negotiating these Abraham Peace Accords to come and visit with us. And again, on a personal note, it's just great to see you again. Very proud of what you've done with your career so far, and look forward to seeing where it goes from here. From here, why don't I turn it over to my co-chair on Iowans Supporting Israel, Tom Henderson, to close us out. Tom?
Hey, thanks a lot. On behalf of ISI, Brian, we want to thank you for speaking to us today. And we'd also like to thank all those who were able to attend the event today as well. We are a tax-deductible nonprofit that operates under generous support from people like you. And we do appreciate any contributions that you might give us to continue the work we've been doing so far on behalf of Iowans Supporting Israel. I'd like to remind everybody that we have more events coming up. Dr. Asher Salman, who's the head of the Department of International Relations of Israel's Ministry of Health, will be with us to speak on April 28th, 2021 at noon to talk about Israel's efforts to combat the COVID-19 pandemic in Israel and also in the surrounding areas. And we hope that you'll join us then and hear what he has to say about that particular issue as well. But again, we want to thank Brian Hook for his generous giving of time today, even though he's on vacation. And we thank you for all attending this event and look forward to seeing you next month, hopefully.
Great. Thanks very much.